anyone who has a blue passport who travels for work, to visit family, or explore. Our son, James Foley, was a conflict journalist who was kidnapped by ISIS in 2012 while covering the civil war in Syria. He was kidnapped and tortured for nearly 2 years before they killed him in a most horrific and public way. No American should endure that fate, and no American family should endure the captivity and loss of their loved ones at the hands of terrorists or rogue nations. So I started the Foley Foundation to ensure that families of those held captive would have the help that our family never had during Jim's captivity, and would have the support of our foundation and our other pro bono partners to help them endure their loved one's captivity while our government and other NGOs work to prioritize their return. Our advocacy has led to a whole of government review, changes on U.S. policy on hostage taking, and a whole new arm of our government that recovers Americans taken hostage and supports their families. That structure we call the hostage enterprise has brought home since 2015 145 innocent fellow Americans, which is truly remarkable. But now we have the new challenge of needing to prevent and deter hostage taking as much as possible while bringing our citizens home. This Sunday, March 9th, is a day codified by our U.S. Congress as Hostage and Detainee Day. It was chosen in memory of Robert Levinson. Part of that prevention is also hostage and wrongful detainee flag. These two codified decisions by our government are powerful ways for us as a nation to reflect on this national crisis and on the duty we owe our fellow citizens. March 9th, this day, we must remember the dozens of Americans who are held unjustly today, at this moment, in Gaza, in Russia, China, Venezuela, and 11 other countries at this very moment. It is a day when we must recognize their suffering and the suffering of their families and renew our national resolve to bring them home. It is also a day of remembrance, a day to recall the American captives who never came home. So before we start our formal presentation, we'd like to take a moment to share the names of Americans who have perished in captivity before we had our current hostage enterprise. So in memoriam, James Wright Foley. We remember Stephen Joel Sotloff, Peter Edward Kasich, Luke Summers, Paul Overby, Warren Weinstein, Kayla Jean Mueller, John Heyman, Leila Shwekani, Maj Kamalmaz, Mustafa Qasem, Robert Levinson, Itai Chen, Gadi Haggai, Judy Weinstein Haggai, Omer Nutra, Hirsch Goldberg Poland, Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce our new and wonderful researcher and hostage advocate, Liz Richards, who will be presenting her first of the 2025 Bringing Americans Home research. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you for everyone for joining us here today. We will go over the results of the 2024 hostage and wrongful detention landscape. We'll start by just kind of framing the problem, then we'll review what we've reported in this review of 2024 report before summarizing the findings and the recommendations based on those findings. So as we start, I think a good way to begin to think about the problem is how we frame it, and to recognize that thousands of Americans are arrested every year, and the vast majority of those arrests are justified, meaning a crime has been perpetrated. However, we also know that Americans are wrongfully detained overseas, and the actual number of Americans being unjustly held may be hard to ascertain at times. And that could be because the information about their detention is unclear, limited information available, unclear circumstances. I think a good example of this is where we were at the end of 2024 when we saw Americans being detained in Venezuela, but there was very little information coming out about it. And that's where at the Foley Foundation, we just start saying this looks like it could be a possible wrongful detention, but we don't really have enough information. And I think the government would also say that there's very limited information at times. As more information becomes available, where we see the presence of Levinson Act criteria, or where we see Americans being treated differently because of their status as an American in that other captured nation's justice system, that's where at the Foley Foundation, we'd start saying this is a probable wrongful detention, and advocate for that person to be designated, and for the Secretary of State to designate that individual, and work to bring that individual home. Because we know from the top of our inverted pyramid to where the Secretary of State officially designates an individual as wrongfully detained, that designation occurs in less than 1% of all cases per the State Department. So the number of arrests we're getting compared to the number of people who are actually officially designated by the Secretary of State, we're talking a very, very small fraction. And we are particularly here at the Foley Foundation, concerned that we could have a higher number of individuals who are unjustly held in this gray area right here that are not getting designated, or their cases aren't known. And not having that agreed upon number of Americans who are being held hostage or wrongfully detained overseas can be an issue at times. We see different media outlets putting out different lists. We saw an example of this came right after Mark Vogel returned home earlier this year. When Mark Vogel returned home, both the AP and Reuters put out their own lists of Americans still being held in Russia. Both the Associated Press and Reuters left out Andrei Kachaturian from their lists of Americans being detained in Russia. Andrei's been unjustly held in Russia since the end of December of 2021. It is a problem when we see media outlets not reporting accurate numbers or missing individuals, because not only does that cause distress for that loved one's family, but from the awareness, from the public understanding of the problem, and then educating the public of what the true scope of the problem is, that lack of clarity can create confusion there. So with all that in mind, believing that clear metrics can help drive behaviors and help with a discussion of a problem, that's where we came to the report that we're discussing, rolled out today and discussing. So when we look at what 2024 looked like in terms of hostage taking and wrongful detentions, we visually kind of graphed out the year here, and we started 2024 with what we assessed at the Foley Foundation as at least 47 Americans being unjustly held, either held hostage or wrongfully detained overseas. We saw that increase by 2 over the beginning of the year, as we saw 2 more unjust arrests early in the year. And it wasn't until around April where we finally started seeing those numbers decrease a little, where we saw 2 individuals have their exit bans eventually removed and be able to return back to the United States. But for a period of time, we didn't see much change until about 1 August, when we saw the historic deal with Russia that brought home 4 Americans. And that's where, at least on the wrongful detention side, we start to see a little more change throughout the latter half of the year in terms of releases from Russia, and also I think in China. We did see at least 2 more Americans towards the end of the year, right before we saw more Americans coming home from China. We did see additional 2 more Americans being taken in other parts of the world. And when we looked at what really surprised me, when we were looking at the hostage taking landscape, um, for 2024, we would say it was relatively um, unchanged for most of the year. At the end of August, that's where we have the tragic murder of Hirschgol in Holland, and the decrease right there. In mid to late October, we see a quick uptick, and then decrease. This was a news team held in South Sudan for about 48 hours, and then released by their captors when they were assessed not to be spies. But for overall, we'd say for 2024, the hostage landscape, we did not see the progress that we would have wanted to see in terms of Americans coming home. When we looked at the past 20 years and tried to put what 2024 looks like in context, what we saw was that since 2025, a significant increase of reported incidents of hostage taking and wrongful detention. We also did a comparison of 2005 to 2014 versus 2015 to 2024. We did that purposely because in 2015 is, as Diane mentioned, that's when President Obama signed the Presidential Policy Directive 30, which established what we now know as the U.S. hostage enterprise tasked with returning Americans. So we were interested to see if there was any difference pre and post PPD 30 in terms of how the hostage and wrongful detention landscape looked. What we did see is that post 2015, we did see significantly more reported cases of wrongful detention. Now, we do think part of that reason could be because there was more media attention given to wrongful detention post 2015, greater awareness of the problem and accounting for it publicly by non-government organizations such as the Foley Foundation. And then specifically in late 2020, we had the Levinson Act that actually codified what the United States considers criteria for wrongful detention. So those are all things to keep in mind as we go through the findings in this report. When we looked at where Americans were held in 2024, we identified at least 17 different countries across the entire year. By the end of the year, Americans were still being held in 15 countries, China and Russia making up about a third of the country, third for where Americans were being wrongfully detained. Now, we do keep in mind, especially in terms with China and Russia, that this count might underestimate the true nature of the problem given the limited consular access in those countries. This is going back to, again, to that inverted pyramid we looked at the beginning of this session, where limited information can sometimes make it hard for the government and make it hard to come to that assessment of, is this detention wrongful? What were the circumstances here? When we looked at new cases of Americans being taken in new cases of Americans being taken in 2024, we were able to identify 7 new cases. That's down by about 66% from the prior year. However, and we try to stress this in the report, we think this could be underestimating the problem. And we specifically in the report mention the detentions in Venezuela. We were aware in late 2024 that Americans were being detained in Venezuela, but had very limited information about those circumstances of detention. And we now know more information about those circumstances. Like we now know that in November of 2024, Joseph St. Clair was wrongfully detained by the government of Venezuela, and that was not shared widely, and it wasn't known, and it wasn't, and that wasn't widely known, making it difficult to estimate how big that problem was. And it also makes it difficult then for the U.S. government to make those designations in a fast and timely manner when that information isn't known. However, as we saw some returns from Venezuela earlier this year and have gotten more information, and also seen just Maduro continue to detain not just Americans, but any foreigners there, such as Lucas Hunter that we saw at the beginning of this year, American French citizen, detained just simply because he was near the border of the country, is because we have been able to go back in 2025 and start reassessing some of those cases. When we looked at pre and post 2015, we did see a significantly more new cases of wrongful detention from 2015 to 2024 compared to the years prior. Again, we think that could be, though, because of some of the factors we've previously discussed, such as greater awareness of the problem and more media attention that helps with the accuracy of counting of the problem. When we looked at how Americans released in 2024, we've assessed at least 17 releases from 6 countries, the majority of those releases involving a prisoner exchange. When we looked at the Americans that came home in 2024, they were held on the average for 4 years, but that range was from 2 days to just over 2 days. So we mentioned that news team that was held and released for about 48 hours and released by their captors to just over 18 years. So again, for the vast majority of these cases, when we talk about Americans being held overseas, we're talking in terms of years, which underscores how long these cases can persist. When we looked at a comparison of 2005 to 2024, again, we did see more Americans who were wrongfully detained being released from 2015 to 2014 compared to the 10 years prior. Again, that's probably likely related to the fact we also saw more Americans being wrongfully detained during that same period. We didn't see any change over time from 05 to 2024, but when we just looked at the 10-year period from 2015 to 2024, we did see a significant increase in releases over time for wrongful detention cases, and that wrongful detention case number also drove overall, when we looked at the total number of Americans being released during this 10-year period, a significant trend over a strong positive relationship over time of Americans being released from 2015 to 2024. When we looked at all this together, at least 54 Americans were held hostage or wrongfully detained at one point in 2024 in 17 countries. We saw at least 17 Americans come home, again, nearly half of those involving some type of prisoner exchange. Based on the analysis we did, we see reported incidents of hostage taking and wrongful detention have increased over the last 20 years, and the threat shifting away from hostage taking by terrorist organizations to wrongful detention by nation states, whereas by the end of the 2024, 83% of the cases, also of the 36 Americans being held, 83% of them were cases involving wrongful detention. Noting that the shift from hostage taking to wrongful detention has led us to the recommendations focusing on prevention and deterrence to stop this problem. For prevention, some recommendations, and these are recommendations that other organizations have put out before too, including past reports here, like use of clear, unambiguous terms and criteria. It should be noted that the United States is the only country that uses the term like wrongful detention. Most of the world, the rest of the world uses arbitrary detention when talking about their citizens who are being unjustly held. if we can even think about too, like I think research is warranted in this area, what terms that we could be using that would be more understandable by the general public to get the public to understand, like, these aren't people who did anything wrong. These are people who are being used and leveraged as bargaining chips to get political concessions or being abused by another captor country's judicial system. We also think in terms of prevention, reliable and transparent data from the U.S. government. Again, going back to what you measure is what you can fix. Being able to talk about the problem in clear numbers to the American people will help, we believe, help the public better understand this problem and then buy into types of prevention efforts that the U.S. government might want to explore in this field. In terms of deterrence, in line with the last year's report that we put out, strong international alliances. We really need to highlight Canada with their arbitrary detention initiative in terms of trying to build like the global norms against hostage diplomacy. And also the robust use of authorities granted by Executive Order 14078. This was signed by President Biden to allow actions against individuals who have involved in the wrongful detention of Americans. Those individuals going down to like the judges in cases or the jailers at these detention centers. We are very much looking forward to the Center for Strategic and Intelligence Studies, their commission on wrongful detention, and their forthcoming reports that will have, I think, more creative and ideas in terms of prevention and deterrence. And finally, knowing again that the threat has shifted from hostage taking to wrongful detention, we were very glad to see the State Department release their strategy for countering wrongful detention this year. We think that more could be done, and like a whole of government study about what policies, what tools, and what else is needed to prevent and deter, to get ahead of the threat, could be useful here. So I will stop sharing and turn it over to the panel at this point.
Okay. Thank you very much, Liz. Definitely appreciate the comprehensive review of the report. So for everyone who's joining online, the full details of the report are now available on the Foley Foundation's website, jamesfoleyfoundation.org. You'll see a section called Research, Our Research, and you can find the full copy of the report there. That was definitely a lot to cover in a short period of time, so we appreciate you hearing us walk through it to give you a little bit of context for today's panel discussion. I'm Benjamin Gray. I'm the Executive Director of the Foley Foundation. I'm so pleased to be a part of this event with our esteemed panelists. I'll introduce each of them, and then we'll move into a few questions that I've prepared. Before I do that, I just want to note that as the discussion is progressing, please do share any questions that you may have for the panel. We should have a little bit of time at the end to address maybe a few of those questions. There is a Q&A section on this on your screen at the top. You should see a Q&A, sort of little thought bubbles with a question mark that you can click there. You can submit a question. We'll review those, and the ones that you see come through on the Q&A from others, you'll have an opportunity to upvote those, meaning you would like to also hear the answer to that particular question. That will help us to get a sense from the room, those participating today, what's on your mind. So that'll help guide the questions I select for the panel as well. So feel free to start putting those in there when you have an opportunity or when a question occurs to you. So let me introduce our panel here. In addition to Liz Richards, we are joined by Holly Lindquist-Thomas. Holly is the Director for Deterrence at the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs at the U.S. State Department. The SPIHA office has primary U.S. government responsibility for the recovery of Americans held wrongfully detained abroad. So those are Americans held by nation states as opposed to non-state actors. Holly's had a number of different posts at the U.S. State Department and is a well-accomplished diplomat in her own right. And so we welcome Holly to the panel. In addition, we have Chris O'Leary, who's a part of the panel as well. Chris is the Senior Vice President for Global Operations at the Sufan Group. Chris has over 2 decades of experience in counterterrorism investigations and operations as an FBI special agent and senior executive. Among his many leadership positions, Chris served as the director of the Interagency Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, which is dedicated to safely bringing home Americans held hostage abroad. So the Fusion Cell is the counterpart, if you like, to the SPIHA office focused on hostage matters as opposed to wrongful detainee matters. So Chris, we're really excited to have you as part of the panel as well. And finally, last but not least, we're honored to have Brian Jenkins join us as well. Brian is a senior advisor to the president and former chair of the political science department at RAND. He is the author of numerous books, reports, and articles on terrorism-related topics. He is also a former Green Beret captain and decorated combat veteran, so we thank Brian certainly for his service. Brian has written probably the seminal work, if you like, on the question which is on almost everyone's minds when we talk about these matters is, whether or not the U.S. concessions policy, which is to not provide concessions in matters of hostage taking, if providing incentives does or does not encourage future hostage taking. And so, we're very thankful to have Brian's expertise. He's not only an academic in that sense, but he has worked, as has Chris and has Holly, on these cases directly and has direct personal experience on getting into the weeds on a particular case and trying to reach a resolution. So there's a lot of practical experience here on the panel here today, and we're very excited. So I wanted to get into the questions that we have for the group here. And the first one is that this is the first time the Foley Foundation, because it has now been 10 years since the hostage enterprise was created, where we've focused on a statistical analysis that aims to compare significant differences between the 10 years prior to the creation of the hostage enterprise, meaning the government reforms of 2015 that created the SPIHA office, that created the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, that created the Hostage Recovery Group at the National Security Council, and the 10 years that have now passed since that time. We believe that that might be the first piece of statistical analysis that's been published with respect to that. Each of you has received a preview of the report prior to today. And I was just going to turn and ask each of you, is there anything that came up that surprised you about the report's findings? And I'll start with Holly.
Well, thanks, Benjamin. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I'd really like to thank the Foley Foundation for holding the event today and for the report. We welcome the findings and appreciate the contribution to our understanding of the hostage and wrongful detainee website. As you've mentioned, we don't have a lot of data, and so every addition that is out there is really helpful to our understanding and can help in our efforts to bring people home. Maybe not a surprise, but we really welcomed the report's conclusion that a greater emphasis on deterrence and prevention is necessary, as well as the recommendation for a proactive approach to get ahead of that threat. We've come to many of the same conclusions ourselves here in the SPIHA office, and we're trying to do a few things ourselves to get ahead of it. First of all, we're devoting more resources to these issues. We now have 4 people on our deterrence and prevention team since the start of this year. Typically, we've had 2 in the past. We're really engaged with key partners. I just returned Friday from a meeting of like-minded countries that were sharing best practices and developing collective action plans to deter and prevent wrongful and arbitrary detentions. And finally, you mentioned the State Department strategy. I guess Liz mentioned the strategy that we released at the end of December. And I just wanted to note the four main pillars in that strategy briefly. It's strengthening U.S. tools, which is really about using all the instruments of national power to proactively counter wrongful detentions. It's building a multinational coalition, and that's engaging in rapid information sharing, coordinating on release efforts, and acting collectively to counter wrongful detentions. Third is strengthening the legal mechanisms and norms. This includes international laws and norms to try to deter broader action and really build up the stigma against these practices. And then finally, just increasing public knowledge through partnership. And a lot of that is private sector and civil society engagement on this issue. I think we're making progress towards these goals, but we really appreciate, again, all the work that you are doing in partnership. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Holly. While you mentioned the international travel that you just completed and international partnerships as being a key part of the strategy that the State Department has released. While I have you, just quick follow-up question. Who would you say are the greatest sort of partners when it comes to deterrence at the international level that you found?
I think the Canadians really have a strong lead on this issue. You mentioned the ADI, the Arbitrary Detention Initiative, and the declaration that they started against arbitrary detention and state-to-state relations. They've got now 80 endorsers of that declaration, which I think is a really strong statement. And they help to organize the international community a little bit. Others, I think it's a little bit more case by case. On some countries, we have more cooperation if there are detainees in a similar country like Iran or Russia or Venezuela, some of the main perpetrators of this action. But certainly the Canadians have a great role to play.
Okay, thank you very much, Holly. I appreciate that. Taking the main question about any surprises over to Chris. Anything that you wanna highlight?
Yeah, I don't think there were any major surprises. I agreed, and with just about everything and the great work that Liz did in pulling together data. I think it's important to have really empirical research into it so we can make the recommended changes to the hostage enterprise and what partnerships and policies we should be building out. I do agree with the reorganization recommendations on the hostage enterprise. I think that's a key point and something that we keep going back to year after year. The hostage enterprise is over a decade old and was really created to make the U.S. interagency more reactive to the threats that ISIS was posing back then. And the geopolitics of the world have changed. The threat landscape has changed. And I don't know that we're quite positioned the way we need to be to address those threats. I will give great credit to the SPIHA's office under Roger Carstens. They really innovated and grew quite a bit and had amazing success because of it. But I'll also point out it was really troubling to see how both the SPIHA's office and the HRFC were somewhat sidelined for the Gaza hostage crisis, where they weren't really utilized in the way that they should have been, that they were built for to help mitigate that threat and being involved in negotiations because they were really just taken out of it. So we purposefully built an enterprise to address the most high, profile matters, but yet we didn't use them in arguably the biggest hostage incident since 1979. So, but again, I think Liz's research will help shape those decisions moving forward.
Yeah. Quick follow-up, Chris. If you had to hazard a guess as to why the established structure wasn't brought in that particular case, what would be your assessment?
Well, I think we deferred to the Israelis on because every American that was taken was also an Israeli citizen. We didn't really have a voice of our own, and we empowered Director Burns and others who, I mean, if there was one chief negotiator, Director Burns was an excellent choice, a career diplomat and very effective in the region. But we really didn't use Roger Shop or the HRFC in any meaningful manner, and I think it was a missed opportunity.
Okay. Yeah, we are aware that the Deputy Spiha was certainly on the ground during that time and working closely with the Israeli government, but agree with the sort of overall approach and in terms of how it was how it definitely played out in terms of who's the sort of principal, or at least public principal, on the matter. To turning then to Brian. Brian, anything from the report that jumped out at you that felt surprising or a nuance that was interesting?
Well, before answering the question, let me sincerely congratulate Liz Richards on her excellent research and thank the Foley Foundation for its continuing efforts to bring Americans home. With regard to the findings of the report itself, I mean, you're talking to here panelists who track these issues on a continuing basis very, very closely. And so I think the consensus among what you've heard thus far, and including myself, is that there are not particular surprises, but let me reinforce some of the observations made. Clearly, as the report points out, the recent numbers are driven by wrongful detentions as opposed to kidnappings by terrorist groups. But that doesn't mean that kidnapping is no longer a major concern, and I would be careful about that. Historically, if we go back before the period covered by this report, we go all the way back to the beginning of hostage taking as a component of contemporary terrorism, we see that terrorist kidnappings rise and fall according to events in specific parts of the world. Certainly the rise in diplomatic kidnappings and ransom kidnappings in Latin America in the early 1970s was one peak. Again, during the Civil War in Lebanon in the 1980s was a second. During the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a third peak, and finally with the Syrian civil war and the rise of ISIS in the 2010s, there was a fourth peak. With regard to the steady accumulation of Americans held abroad until 2022, and then that reverses sharply. The growth of that, in my view, reflects all of the factors that Liz mentioned, but also there is one more, and I think this is another danger sign for the future, and that is it reflects the normalization of wrongful detentions as an instrument of coercive diplomacy. I think finally, the releases that have taken place, especially in recent years, those cases that have been so effectively resolved, they demonstrate two things. One, that skillful diplomacy can bring Americans home, but there is almost always a quid pro quo, either in terms of an exchange of prisoners or because the detaining nations expect some type of diplomatic gains because of it. I think that really makes the point that this is clearly coercive diplomacy.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate the historical, even before the time period we're talking about, sort of perspective, because it definitely gives us a sense of where this has been and how it has evolved over time. Thank you. So the second question, and I do see, by the way, questions coming into the Q&A, so thank you, everyone. Appreciate that. We're publishing those as we are reviewing them simultaneously, so please do indicate with an upvote if you would like to see that question posed towards at the latter half of the panel. But back for our panelists, I think Liz took great pains, and we usually do as well in our written reports. We always do, I should say, to make clear that reported data are, likely an undercount of the true nature of the threat, for all the reasons that Liz has put forward. Just the visibility of what you can find through open source reporting really relies on often individuals on the ground, or the captor has to say something about it in a public forum. We also get information because we are advocates for families. When families come to us to ask for help or assistance, that is information that is privately provided. It does contribute to the public count that we put out there, but certainly not all families know where to go. A lot of them don't, and we're not in touch with all families. So we do realize that this is likely an undercount. Um, so the question is, should the government publish official statistics on this topic, on this national security issue? And I'll just note as we turn to that question, the new presidential envoy for hostage affairs nominee, Adam Bowler, not yet confirmed, has in a recent interview with News Nation indicated that he thought those numbers should be published. That historically that has not been the case. So I'll go in reverse order here, but Brian, do you have a thought on whether or not there's value in publishing those statistics, or are there risks that should be evaluated?
Benjamin, I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian on this one, and I really would suggest caution in publishing official lists. Let me give you 5 reasons quickly. Some families of the hostages, those held wrongfully, do not wish to be publicly identified. They may feel that they can, on their own account, do better if their loved one is not on an official list. Second, determining whether an individual is wrongfully detained can be a judgment call. The report itself indicates that it can be a judgment call. A third, I worry about an official list being seen somehow as a first-class ticket as opposed to an economy ticket, and creating some resentment. And that leads me to my 4th concern. Those not on the list still should receive consular assistance, as they do. But if that means we need to upgrade consular assistance and strengthen that component of our work, then we should do so. And when opportunities arise, those who are not on the official list may be included in exchanges anyway, whether they're on a list or not. A public list, and this is my final point, a public list in some cases may complicate diplomacy, because it in a sense puts that case in a spotlight, and it may make it harder to make deals. In my view, the primary objective here is bringing Americans home, not getting people on lists.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for a very thoughtful response there. Certainly, we have understood that raising a case's profile can raise the potential value in the eyes of the captor of a particular individual. To some of your earlier points, we obviously don't put forward names of families unless they A, want us to, and B, it's in terms of our own advocacy, B, it is seen as helpful to the case itself. And so I think the intent of the question is, even at the aggregate level, without names attached to particular cases, numbers of hostages, numbers of wrongful detainees, without going into specific details of cases, the report really tries to speak to that as a public education tool. I don't know if you had a quick reaction, but otherwise I'll turn to Holly here.
Is that question for me, Benjamin?
Yeah, I didn't
Yeah,
know if there was any.
you know, look,
Yeah.
numbers are okay. Not necessarily with names, although with, you know, an aggressive news media, numbers lead to questions about names, and so I understand the dilemma here. The problem is bigger than any list of names. It may be bigger than it's certainly bigger than the numbers that are reported. And but I still would prefer keeping this in general terms, and we can make that point, as you have, I think, done so well in a report, that those actually identified in specific cases, and the cases identified here, represent only, you know, you've got that inverted pyramid there with the fractions. And I think that point needs to be emphasized. I do note that in looking at the government lists, looking at other lists around, all of the lists, are different. One suggestion I would make is that while we obviously are concerned with American nationals, this is a global problem, and it may make sense in the future to try to come up with at least some estimate of how many nationals are being wrongfully detained on a global scale, whether they're Canadians, British, you know, or wherever they're from, and get an idea that might say that, look, this is a bigger international problem, and we are one piece of it.
Right. Yeah, that would certainly speak to the international coalition's building aspect. Holly, do you want to jump in on this question? I know it's it's obviously a sensitive one for the government, and it has taken a stance up until this point that in favor of not publishing those statistics.
Yeah, thanks. I think to date, we have not made those statistics available for many of the reasons that Brian mentioned. Also, that the numbers tend to be quite fluid, and so it's really difficult to get an accurate count at any one time, because of that fluidity. It's really sort of two questions too, because that wrongful detention determination that we make can sometimes be quite a long process, and so I think that adds to the kind of arbitrariness of what a number would represent. So for many of those reasons, we've hesitated to do that. But I think this is something where, you know, the suggestions from NGOs largely shaped the work of SPIA, and will continue to do so. And I think, as you mentioned, there may be some willingness to look at this again. But for now, I think that we'll probably continue to hold some of that information when we have it.
Sure. And I will note there is reporting required by law from the hostage enterprise to Congress. Our understanding is that reporting is provided in classified settings, and usually doesn't then make its way out into the public. Chris, do you have a thought on this?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Brian and Holly have said. I will say, you know, we've, you know, talked about this quite a bit over time, and talked to NGOs about it. You know, often you'll see people wanting the SPIHA to jump in for every American that's detained, ever so briefly, sometimes overseas. And in many of the cases, and any RSO and an embassy can tell you, a lot of Americans are detained for good reason, because they've done something that triggered their detention. It's when they are then used as currency against the U.S. government because of their citizenship, that is when they become unlawfully detained. And it takes the SPIA's office some time to determine that. So the question would be, you know, how often would you like a list published of Americans detained overseas? What length of time do they have to be detained that they should be, you know, make it on some kind of reported list? And there's no good answer for that. And then the other point I will kind of foot stomp on is our negotiators or our diplomats need room to maneuver. And often if you make those names public, it is counterproductive. There may be a time where you want to produce their name as a tool in your negotiations, but that should be left up to the negotiators or the diplomats in making those negotiations.
So making it a tactical sort of decision, case by case. Liz, I'm gonna let you have a final word if you'd like to provide it. On having heard from the panelists, the rest of the panelists here, any concluding thought on the publishing the data?
Oh, no, and thank you, and appreciate everyone's thoughts on this. To be clear, I don't think what writing the report meant to like put out an official list of names like these are the exact individuals the U.S. government deems as wrongfully detained, but to speak about the numbers again. I know I'm very much someone who believes that metrics drive behavior, and if we want the general public to care about Americans being held hostage and wrongfully detained overseas, I think they need to have some type of concrete number in mind to understand the problem and see how does this affect them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Yeah, and just to note, like, I mean, everyone's talked about the difficulty in gathering these numbers. Liz's full-time job is gathering these numbers and helping to do this assessment and putting out the data that we have, you know, or the assessment that we have based on the available data. So if anyone wants to keep a tab on that, not only do we periodically release full reports, but our count is always available on our website front page. So that's just a tool available. Sorry, Liz.
Oh, and I forgot to mention, I know it's the points that Brian, Holly, and Chris had also made. Absolutely, it's a family's decision if they want their case to be public or not. We wouldn't want to ever force a family to be public when they wouldn't want to be. We are very grateful for Adam Bowler calling the attention to this on his recent Twitter or X thread as well, where families who are public have been able to share their stories publicly. We would want to also remind people that there are a lot of families who are not public because of the fear of retaliation against their loved one being held, and making sure that those families still have avenues into government officials and not just through consular affairs to make sure that their advocacy is being heard.
Thanks, Liz, for that. Okay, I'm going to turn to the next question. Certainly, we ended the report and also Liz's presentation really focused on a recommendation to do more on prevention and deterrence. So I think everyone wants that, right? Everyone wants the problem to not be as much of a problem, and certainly getting ahead of it is the way to do that. A very complex issue. Just from an understanding from the public standpoint, we talk about these categories of prevention and deterrence. I would like to get sort of the panelists' thoughts on what is meant by prevention and what is meant by deterrence, so that we can help people understand sort of the context. And part of that is, you know, who does the prevention and who does the deterrence? Like, whose role is it? Holly, I'd like to turn to you since you just issued the report in January from the State Department recommending or with the strategy. When the State Department thinks about prevention and deterrence, how do you think about what falls into those categories?
Yeah, thanks, Benjamin. I think we typically think about three things when we talk about prevention. So I'll start with that. We think about travel advisories, and that's the State Department's Bureau of Consular Affairs that issues travel advisory pages for every country, and that includes critical information about the safety and security for U.S. travelers. These pages also include specific indicators about certain risks, and when there is a risk of wrongful detention in a country, a D indicator, it's just a large letter D, is included in that travel advisory page. So we currently have 9 countries that have the D indicator, and that includes Afghanistan, Burma, Eritrea, Iran, Nicaragua, North Korea, Russia, Syria, and Venezuela. Consular Affairs constantly reviews these and to ensure they're up to date with current events. There's also a K indicator for hostage taking, and I think there are about 30 countries right now that have that K indicator. So that's sort of the first prevention tool that we have. The second is also something that Consular Affairs works on, but we also work on, and that's ad campaigns. We often hear that the right people are not looking at the travel advisories, that they're not effective because a lot of travelers just don't go there. So we've been looking to try to be more creative with how travel advisory related information is presented to the public, try to get more views, more clicks, working on ad campaigns and ensuring that these pages load on search engines to optimize the U.S. nationals or the number of U.S. nationals viewing these risks. And then also just thinking about where people need to get these messages, whether it's at airports, whether it's when they're making their travel arrangements through travel websites. When is it that we can reach out to them so that we get them at a variety of touch points as they're planning their travel. The third thing that we've really tried to focus on a little bit more in the past year or so in the SPIA office is private sector engagement. We've been actively engaging a number of companies and have identified certain sectors where people are at heightened risk, for example, the gas and oil sector and others. A good example of some of the outreach we've done was at the recent OSAC annual brief. This is a State Department advisory council for businesses that work overseas. So our deputy special envoy spoke on a panel there for hundreds of companies about the various risks. We also did a tabletop exercise following that panel, and we had about 150 company representatives present for that, where we walked through a scenario where an employee of a company was detained, and then walked through what the company would do sort of at every step. And then once it was clear that it was a wrongful detention, what the company could do, how they could engage on the ground with an embassy in that fictitious country, and then engage with us as well. So I think those kinds of trainings and outreach are really important to make sure that we're hitting the right people that are the most at risk traveling overseas. In some cases, our message is pretty clear that we don't want people to travel to certain countries. But in other cases, and when people are not willing to turn off their travel, we want to make sure that they are taking all the necessary steps to try to mitigate the risks and really plan for the worst case scenarios. So I think that's where we focus in terms of prevention. On deterrence, we think more about deterrence in our government engagements, and we talked a little bit about our cooperation with Canadians and others. So it's really about raising the cost of hostage diplomacy so that it's not considered a viable option. This includes looking at punitive measures and messaging about further ramifications for those who detain U.S. citizens, and strengthening the global or regional norms, including through international bodies, to condemn the practice. In line with our strategy that I mentioned at the outset, we want to strengthen our deterrence tools. And so those kinds of tools that we're looking at are things like sanctions and travel advisories. Consistent with the Levinson Act, we've imposed 15 sanction designations against actors in Iran, Russia, and hostage takers in Mali. And we'd like to use this program more robustly in the future. We also have 2 new visa restriction programs that target foreign actors involved in wrongful detentions. These actions also apply to the immediate family members of the perpetrators, and we think that can amplify the impact of these travel restrictions. And then also in line with our second pillar, we seek to coordinate our actions with like-minded partners, because we know that no one country can effectively raise the costs for these actors. And so doing so in partnership, we think is a much more effective approach. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Holly. Appreciate that. Just quick follow-up, because we do have a question in the Q&A that I think relates to this in particular. When you think about on the prevention side, you mentioned outreach the government is doing to private sector companies that might be at risk, the trainings and sort of awareness. What do you see as something ordinary citizens or the public could do to support or to help prevent this issue from growing. And by that it could be individuals, it could be NGOs like the Foley Foundation. What do you see as that sort of outside of government role in helping to prevent this issue from growing?
I think there are a couple of things. I think we've tried to do a little bit of outreach to diaspora groups who are at high risk. Certainly, Iranian Americans are at high risk. And I think a common refrain that we hear is that people just don't think that this will happen to them. And so getting some outreach out there to some of those groups, I think, is important.
So that would be like communities where there's a significant number of dual citizens, for instance, who might be traveling back and forth.
Exactly.
Okay.
We have found that, as I think Diane mentioned in the beginning, just simply having the U.S. passport can put you at risk in some places like Iran. And so we need to get that word out to the people who are going to be traveling there. Other things, I think sometimes we'll see some trends. Like recently, we've seen adventure tourists going to places like Afghanistan. There was a couple recently picked up from in Iran from the UK. People that are trying to hit every country and things like that. And I think we need to get the word out that there really are serious risks of going to some of these places, and maybe work more with the private sector who are organizing these trips. Academia can be another sector where research is going on and people are not fully attuned to what the hazards might be of going to a place, even for academic research. Again, they think that it won't happen to them or that they're insulated because they're associated with the university. So those are some of the things that I think we can do more outreach about, whether it's NGOs or government or others, but trying to really talk to the people who are thinking about traveling.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the comprehensive responses there. Some of my later questions were more around specific actions that could be taken sort of within those two buckets. So we'll roll that together because I do want to get to some of the questions in the Q&A. We do have some folks who've joined whose loved ones are currently being detained abroad or held hostage, and so I do want to touch on those questions as well. But just to turn it then to Brian on these two buckets of prevention and deterrence. What do you think would be some effective new things to try or things to amplify or do differently that might move the needle on the issue?
I think that Holly has given a good rundown of the catalog of things that the State Department is trying to do. I mean, some of those can be escalated. We can move from travel warnings to outright travel bans, that is simply forbidding, making it illegal to travel to certain countries. We can warn people that who go to some of these countries with those warnings anyway, that that can in fact negate or at least reduce their claim on American assistance if they are detained. That we can be very, very specific and blunt if we wanted to go that far, to warn that, for example, dual nationals who sometimes use a non-US passport, the passport of their original country, when they arrive in that country, that in fact the use of another passport can clearly negate any moral claim or that they have on American assistance. With regard to deterrence options, there's a number of things that have been talked about. One is some have argued that a strict no concessions, no negotiations, no concessions, no exchanges of prisoners policy will deter wrongful detention. I'm not sure that will work any better than it has with dealing with terrorist kidnappings. It may work in theory, but it also gets into a profoundly philosophical debate about fundamental values. And I should point out that that debate goes back centuries. Holly mentioned the imposition of sanctions, and that's always a possibility, but one has to keep in mind, if you look at the countries that are the serial wrongful detaining countries, these are countries that already violate the rights of their own citizens, so they're not likely to necessarily be deterred by violating the rights of foreign nationals. And many of these countries are already heavily sanctioned. We don't have a lot of headroom for escalation. We finally come down to the issue of retaliation. In the 18th century, Great Britain went to war with Spain over Jenkins' ear. No relation, by the way, but an incident that led to a war that lasted years. I'm not sure that going to war is necessarily in a national interest in every single case. I'm not going to say we always rule out military force. However, the threat of military action may be more effective in preventing detainees from being executed. I recall that this threat was used by the Carter administration against Iran during the hostage crisis in Tehran, when the government was talking about trying and executing the diplomats for espionage. And when that threat was communicated, in fact, talk of trials ceased. If we are going to talk about retaliation, then we need to be a bit more creative and perhaps figure out ways how to do this with a degree of constructive ambiguity. Let me, as a final comment, just go beyond the issue of prevention and deterrence. And one area that deserves mention is really skillful diplomacy. I don't really believe that there's some kind of a philosopher's stone here that will enable us to turn wrongful detention lead into leverage gold. But I think some of the recent examples that have brought individuals home really reflect the skillful diplomacy, bringing in other nations to carry out these multi-part operations. That requires a coalition effort to do so, and that is critical. The United States ought not to be and put itself in a position of being a lone actor on these. Coalitions and these things work, and coalition diplomacy can make deals that are otherwise beyond the reach of any single nation.
Right. I think it's an important distinction to call out. The U.S. doesn't have diplomatic relations with all countries, including a number of captor countries who take our people. And as a result, we also don't have as many commercial relations, but other countries do. Some of our allies do, and so sometimes by partnering, leverage can be sort of acquired through our allies that we wouldn't otherwise have directly. And then briefly, just on your sort of your comment about going to war, even sort of at a smaller scale, military rescue operations certainly are very, very high risk, and have a sort of uneven track record in terms of being able to successfully extract a hostage from the situation. And it's unfortunately there's a bit of a public sort of perception that is a I guess a more successful potentially option than I think what we've seen bared out in the data that we track. But I want to bring Chris in on this topic as well of sort of prevention and deterrence. what would you want to add, Chris?
So I would just say, number one, unfortunately, I don't think there's a cure, any single thing that's going to deter nation states from, taking American citizens, or certainly not terrorist organizations from taking American citizens hostage. I mean, the global landscape is constantly shifting. Rogue nations are going to violate norms, even if we establish them with our international community partners. So that's one thing. The terrorism threat landscape, although the numbers reflect that there's been a little bit of a dip in the taking of American hostages, that could rapidly shift. And that could be fueled by the United States announcing that we're going to own Gaza, that we're pulling USAID aid back from some of the most needy countries, and that could drive, members like Janum or Al-Shabaab or others to start looking for revenue sources because there's, greater suffering in the communities. You don't know what that's going to turn into. But the one thing you do know is with globalization, Americans are traveling all over the world, and they're exposing themselves to these threats. So I think looking at ways to synchronize our response with our close partners and allies is incredibly important, that we have unified messaging in major hostage incidents, that we can share resources, authorities, and capabilities, and really just have a multinational response to some of these incidents.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. And Liz has obviously presented some of our initial thoughts there as well. I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A with our last 15 minutes or so. And for anyone who hasn't submitted a question, certainly the Q&A is open, and would appreciate, as you're starting to do, upvote some of those questions as well, so we can make sure we're hitting on topics of interest. As I mentioned, we have some attendees joining who are family members of whose loved ones are being held hostage or wrongfully detained in different parts of the world. One of the questions, the top voted questions here, is that often families are told to be quiet and not to make their case public, that there can be downsides that we talked about in terms of having their name out there in terms of potentially complicating bringing them home. And then, but obviously without a formal designation, Holly had mentioned that wrongful detention designation process can take a very long time as well. Families are often sort of in limbo, trying to pursue a designation, trying to get the government's attention. The question then that's been posed is, how can those families really get more of attention from the government, get them focused on the case and sharing more information about what the government may or may not be doing, and really have some sort of comfort that something's happening? Are there particular methods or approaches that you might advise a family to think about if they're trying to get that more information or trying to get more attention? Specifically, the question poser wanted to know the value of face-to-face interactions with government officials who deal with these issues. So maybe we'll start there on that particular aspect of the question. Holly, I don't know if you have a thought on that. We have folks on here who've both deal or have worked on these cases from inside government and the wrongful detention side, and also on the hostage side as well. Holly, is there any particular value that you see in terms of those interactions face to face in terms of families' advocacy?
I think there is. I do want to make it clear that before we get a case here in the SPIHA office, that there is consular engagement with families, and they always have the consular access when there is access. It's the consular side of the State Department that is able to go and visit people who are wrongfully detained. That said, it does unlock resources when we can get someone declared wrongfully detained, and it means that we are able to negotiate on behalf for their relief, on their behalf for their release, and that's so crucial to have that determination. So I do think that it's helpful for the families to try to talk to decision makers and really get their case. It's that personal touch that means so much. So I do think that that's helpful. I did want to say too, on the question, I think you started your question talking about media, and I think mostly we do not discourage families to talk to the media. There are some exceptions if we think that negotiations are at certain crucial points. We may ask a family to hold off on going to the media, but by and large, I think that more attention is often better. And I think Liz made the point at the beginning that Americans need to know about these issues, and sometimes the best way for an average American on the street to understand an issue is through a personal story like that. It's going to mean more than just the numbers or something like that. So I think that oftentimes the media engagement can be really helpful in terms of getting that case out to the broader spotlight and bringing it up to decision makers as well.
Sure. And you mentioned consular affairs, just for the audience here. Consular officers who are at the embassies in countries where we have diplomatic relations would be the first point of contact with an American who has been detained in that country. Obviously, we don't have consular affairs in every country because we don't have diplomatic relations with every country, but there can be sort of ways through other countries that consular can try to get information. And then, of course, there's the Bureau of Consular Affairs in DC that is looking sort of holistically at consular matters. I would imagine you would say, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the cost of traveling to a country to meet with a consular officer, there are virtual ways of doing that, I would assume, that could be done. And then also, the consular office in DC could also be domestically could be a resource. So making those deliberate requests, I would imagine is what you're referring to before that case becomes designated as wrongfully detained.
I would add too that it's now in the law that once a family member is designated as a wrongful detainee, that the family members can come to talk to Washington to engage with senior governmental officials on their case, and that will be reimbursed for I think it's just a couple days a year, but it
Sure.
is an opportunity for people to engage with senior officials.
Okay. If they have that designation. And then, Chris, do you want to speak to that particular issue about publicity and the value of face-to-face interactions, thinking about it from the hostage-taking side?
Yeah, so from the hostage-taking side, it's a little different. As soon as the HRC gets notified of an event, I mean, things start happening rapidly, and I can point to a great case that my predecessor, Kieran Ramsey, led, which was a rapid response to recover Philip Walton, really in about 48 hours. But as soon as there's information that an American's been taken hostage by a terrorist organization, the interagency moves into action. But what also happens while whether intelligence or military forces are positioning themselves, we also have our family engagement team contacting the victims' families. We have FBI agents responding to support them, and the negotiators are going to partner with the family as well. So we try to coordinate the actions, and we have Brian Jenkins on here with us, who famously said that terrorism is theater. So you don't want to unnecessarily promote this incident going on, because depending on who the threat actor is or what the situation is, you might only be pouring gasoline on a fire. So there may be a time where you want to use the media as part of your messaging, but that should be part of a really coordinated strategy. So we try to prevent the families from doing that, certainly in the early days, and we work with them. If they really feel like they need to have a voice, they will have that opportunity, but we try to shape things moving forward.
Okay, thank you. And then Liz, taking off your researcher hat for a minute and putting on your hostage advocacy hat in the role that you have. Do you want to comment on the maybe the challenges that families face interacting with the government when they do want to get that sort of attention, and what you've seen as valuable in certain cases? Sorry, Liz, are you frozen there?
No, can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Thank you.
Sorry. To the point that Holly made it, that unless you're designated, you're paying out of pocket to come to DC. And that can be expensive and an obstacle for families at times. So making sure that we're getting the right meetings set up in advance, so you're seeing the right people. And have been in those consular affairs meetings with families and asking for information and what else, family asking what else can they do to better partner with consular, and hearing the response, just share any information you have without that two-way street of communication. It can be frustrating. Outside of consular affairs, though, meeting with your congressional representatives and having their sharing the story with your congressional representatives in both the House and the Senate, getting them to reach out to the State Department and advocate on your behalf and the behalf of your loved one who's detained as well. That can be powerful. And on the question of the media, again, it is every family's choice, and it is a personal choice. We've actually, for the report that would come out later this year, the qualitative report on the family engagement piece, that was a new question we added specifically because it is a common question that we hear from families. And while we haven't done the full analysis of the results, of one thing I know we've heard over and over is just like the importance of thinking about and having a media strategy if you're going to engage with the media. And that just because the media reaches out and asks you a question doesn't mean you need to respond, but being very intentional about how you use that outreach.
Okay, thank you, Liz. I think that's important context. Okay, we've got just about 7 minutes left or so. I want to leave a couple minutes just to wrap up at the end here. There's a question in the chat from an individual who had says Director of Hostage Affairs in Iraq in the 2007-2008 timeframe, noting that the U.S. government policy was more stringent on no concessions, and that he felt that was, if I'm reading this correctly, a deterrent factor in future kidnappings. Brian, obviously you've done research on this, and if you, in your response, if you kind of give us a sort of synopsis of your research on the deterrence factor with the U.S. no concessions policy, and then just sort of note that, as I think you have previously, the distinctions when it comes to wrongful detention.
In terms of whether a no concessions or no negotiations policy is an effective deterrent, a couple of things. If there is a widespread perception, if we were to add to a widespread perception, this is dealing with terrorist kidnappings now, that the United States stands ready to go to the U.S. Treasury to provide funds for any American who is taken hostage by terrorists, that would be clearly an incentive, and there is evidence to show that, for example, where corporations in the early 70s were paying escalating ransoms into the tens of millions of dollars in one particular case, that was clearly an encouragement for that activity to continue and the demands to escalate. Now, does that mean a no a no concessions policy works as a deterrent, and no, the mere side doesn't. There's not strong evidence to support that. The most powerful deterrent on the basis of the research that we were able to discover at that time was what happens to the kidnappers themselves. If there is apprehension, if there is a destruction of the kidnapping gang or the terrorist group, then it goes down. And the reason it doesn't work on the reverse side is that, number one, not all of the groups know about it. Number two, more importantly, even if they know about it, they may not believe it. And in fact, the number of the true escapes or true rescues are believed by some of the extremist groups to have been, well, that wasn't really a rescue or an escape, that was arranged, and it was really, the government provided some ransom. Now that may be nonsense, but we're dealing with perceptions here. But I think in terms of terrorist kidnappings, the most important reason it doesn't work is that gaining the concessions is not the only objective. These organizations know that by kidnapping an American, they create, or any other national, they create a political crisis. They cause dilemmas for that government. They obtain a tremendous amount of publicity, which they're looking for, and they will achieve that regardless of whether the demands are met. So it's not exclusively demands being met. With regard to wrongful determinations, it is simply a different dynamic. And in that particular case, the no concessions policy, in my view, there's not really persuasive, convincing evidence to support the assumption upon which that policy would be based. Now, that doesn't mean you make bad deals, but certainly if you go throughout history, put aside the labels, we have exchanged prisoners, we have swapped spies, we do what is necessary under very specific circumstances to try to bring our fellow nationals back to the United States, whether they were serving in the military, whether they were diplomats, whether they were civilians. We see that as an obligation to American citizens to do what we can to get them back.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. It's always great to have that context of having someone who has looked at a number of these cases over a long time, each of which is different, each of which has certain circumstances associated with it, and so it can sometimes make it difficult to draw large conclusions. We're coming to the end of the time here. I'm going to very just briefly offer a comment on one of the questions in the chat. We won't be able to have time to discuss it, but one of the families has talked about the public nature of a wrongful detention designation, and as we mentioned, sometimes that can complicate by putting a label on it and being public about it. It can complicate the government's efforts to bring them home. What we have seen in our advocacy is, sorry, I didn't mean to do the emoji, is that the government does sometimes take action on a case without a wrongful detention designation. The downside for the family, though, is that they are denied the benefits in law associated with that designation until it's put in place, and the returnee doesn't, if they come back, don't have access to those benefits as well. And the family is often not told. So it's a bit of a conundrum in the sense that the government seems to be doing the things that it would be doing if it had put that detention designation or wrongful detention designation in place, but it's not putting the label on it. So it does seem like we've noted this in our research, there should be a way for a private designation to happen that's not public, that gives the family some assurance that something's happening. The family's incentives are aligned to certainly not disrupt a prospect to bring their loved one home. So I think that'll be a a topic for further discussion in our research. But we're over time. I just wanted to leave everyone. First of all, I wanted to thank our panelists. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Brian and Liz, for your contributions today. Your expertise is very valued, and hopefully contributed to a wider understanding of the issue as it has been historically, but also as we see it presently today. Just two reminders for folks who, as you leave, one, we'll be putting up a recording of this session for folks who may have missed it to access. Secondly, the U.S. State Department is hosting a Hostage and Wrongful Detainee Day event tomorrow. The registration is too late to formally register for it in person, but it will be live streamed. You should be able to see some of that on our social media and as a way to join. And then third, just wanted to flag that the Foley Foundation will be hosting our annual Foley Freedom Awards on April 29th, which brings together the whole hostage community to include government officials, members of the media, hostage families, and returnees, and that is a fundraiser to continue our advocacy. And so we'd appreciate if folks have an interest to go to foleyfreedomawards.org to see about buying a ticket. So thank you, everyone, for today's session. We really appreciate it. Thanks for caring about this issue. We'll say goodbye. Thanks.